Dale Whitmore's phone rang on a Thursday afternoon, and the voice on the other end asked a question that would have made no sense a year earlier. "You still got any of that sawdust?" Dale walked to the kitchen window and looked out toward the fence line. There wasn't much left. What remained was a low, dark mound, nothing like what had once been there. "I can check," he told the man. "Might have some. Not a lot." He hung up and stood there a moment, half smiling at the strangeness of it, because 8 months earlier, that same material had been something a sawmill was desperate to be rid of. Something Kurt Halloway had all but begged him to take off his hands. Something half the county had assumed Dale had lost his mind accepting. Now farmers he barely knew were calling to ask if he had any left. The pile itself told the story if you knew how to read it. At its biggest, it had run nearly the length of his north fence, pale gold and taller than the bed of his truck, swallowing a section of pasture whole. Neighbors slowed down on the county road just to look at it. A couple of them laughed outright. One man told him flatly he'd taken on somebody else's problem for free. What none of them understood that day was what the pile would eventually become, or why, of all things, it would be other farmers asking him for more of it. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the Tuesday morning the first truck arrived. Dale Whitmore was 54, and he'd worked the same 160 acres outside a small town in the Missouri Ozarks since he was 17. Cattle, mostly with enough hay ground to get them through winter, and a side garden that sold well at the Saturday market when cattle prices didn't cooperate, which lately felt like most of the time. He wasn't struggling in any dramatic way. He was struggling in the ordinary way most small farmers struggle. Feed costs climbing faster than calf prices. Equipment older than his youngest son. A banknote that didn't care whether it rained. What Dale had, more than money, was a habit of noticing what other people threw away. Not sentimental about it. He just hated waste in the plain, unglamorous sense. A fence post with 10 good years left in it. A stock tank with a fixable leak. That habit is what put him at the sawmill that Tuesday in the first place. The mill sat 4 miles from his place. A family operation Kurt Halloway's grandfather had started. Dale caught Kurt at the feed store, and Kurt mentioned almost offhand that the mill had a problem. "We're drowning in sawdust," Kurt said. "Burn barn's full, and the state's been asking questions about open burning again. I've got more of it than I know what to do with, and nowhere to put it." Dale asked how much. "More than you'd want," Kurt said. "But I'll cover the hauling if you'll take it. Beats paying a disposal outfit to cart it off." That was the arrangement, plain and practical. Kurt needed the material gone, and hauling it to Dale's place cost him less than any other option he had. Dale wasn't buying anything. He was solving a problem for a man he'd known his whole life, and getting something out of it he didn't yet understand the value of. He should have asked more questions about how much more than you'd want actually meant. He didn't. By Thursday, trucks were backing up along his fence line. CTA 1. If you enjoy realistic stories about farmers finding opportunity in things everybody else considers a headache, stick around. There's a lot more to this one. The trucks kept coming most of that morning. Dale stood by the fence and watched the pile grow past anything he'd pictured in his head. What had started as a modest mound by the second load had become, by the fifth, a long, pale ridge running the better part of 40 feet, swallowing the corner of pasture where he used to park the hay equipment. He hadn't asked for a number in tons. He'd asked for the sawdust, the way you'd agree to take a friend's old furniture without checking how big the truck was. Standing there afterward, hands on his hips, he understood he'd taken on a lot more than he'd bargained for. Word travels fast in a small farming community, and by Saturday, half the county had heard Dale Whitmore let a sawmill dump a mountain of shavings on his land. His neighbor, Ray Doblin, drove past twice just to look at it. "You really taking all of that?" Ray asked, leaning out his window. "Looks that way," Dale said. "What are you going to do with it?" "Working on that." Ray laughed, not unkindly, and shook his head. "Well, you've got plenty of time to figure it out." Not everyone was that gentle. A man at the co-op told him flat out he'd created a bigger mess than the mill ever had, since at least the mill had a burn barn. Dale didn't argue. Some days, standing at the edge of that pile, he wasn't sure the man was wrong. That first week, the practical questions started stacking up. Fresh sawdust straight off the saw isn't something you can spread wherever you please. It's mostly carbon, and when it's mixed into soil before it's broken down, the microbes working to decompose it pull nitrogen out of the ground to do the job. Nitrogen that would otherwise be feeding whatever you're trying to grow. Used the wrong way, it can leave a garden bed worse off than before you touched it. Dale had used small amounts before, mostly bedding down calving pens in winter. He hadn't understood how differently the material behaved at real scale, or how much it mattered to handle it right. The lesson was starting to take shape in his head, even if he couldn't have said it out loud yet. The sawdust itself wasn't worth anything. What would be worth something was knowing what to do with it. His first real attempt didn't go the way he hoped. Dale figured composting was the obvious use. The sawdust was carbon-rich, and he had plenty of manure to balance it. He built a rough pile behind the barn, layering sawdust and fresh manure by eye, guessing at the ratio because he didn't have a better method and didn't think he needed one. 4 days passed, then a week. The pile should have been heating up by then, the way a working compost pile does. Instead, it sat there, damp and heavy, refusing to do much of anything. Dale drove a pitchfork into the center of it one morning expecting warmth, and found it barely above the temperature of the morning air. When he pulled the fork back out, the smell that came with it was sour instead of earthy, more like standing water than good compost. He'd used far too much sawdust relative to manure, and the pile didn't have enough nitrogen to get the decomposition going. It just sat there doing nothing, while the bulk of 8 tons still sat untouched along the fence line, exactly where it had been dumped. That week, standing over a pile that wasn't working, with far more material left than he had any plan for, it felt less like an opportunity and more like a mistake he'd be looking at for years. Carol found him out there one evening, kicking at the edge of the failed pile with his boot. "It's not working the way I figured," he told her. "So figure it different," she said, and went back inside. He started reading university extension bulletins on composting ratios, old notes from a neighbor who'd raised hogs on sawdust bedding for decades, a couple of calls to the state extension office that made him feel a little foolish for not calling sooner. He learned he needed something closer to 2 or 3 parts sawdust to 1 part manure by volume, not the rough eyeball mix he'd used the first time. He learned turning the pile regularly mattered as much as what went into it, and he learned that fresh sawdust needed time, weeks, sometimes longer, before it stopped competing with anything trying to grow near it. He rebuilt the pile that fall with better ratios, added some spoiled hay for extra nitrogen, and started turning it with the tractor's front loader every couple of weeks. This time, 10 days in, he stuck his hand into the center of the pile and felt real heat. On a cold morning not long after, steam rose visibly off the top of it when he broke it open with a shovel. The smell had changed too, from sour to something dark and earthy, like the floor of a hardwood forest after rain. Over the following weeks, the color shifted from pale gold to deep brown, the texture going from coarse shavings to something crumbly that held together in his hand. It was working. slowly, but working. By late winter, Dale had a few cubic yards of finished compost, along with a separate section of the pile he'd kept dry and set aside for bedding, since dry sawdust used in reasonable amounts in a calving barn absorbs moisture well and keeps pens from turning into mud. He tried the compost first on a stretch of pasture that had always given him trouble. Thin soil, poor drainage, grass that struggled every summer no matter what he tried. He didn't expect much. He just wanted to see if it made any difference at all. By late spring, that section was holding moisture noticeably better than the rest of the field through a dry stretch in June. The grass wasn't spectacular. It was thicker, though, and stayed green longer than it ever had before. More importantly to Dale's bottom line, he'd spent almost nothing on soil amendments for that section, money he'd normally have put into commercial fertilizer. He'd saved money before he'd made a dime off any of it. That mattered more to him than anything flashier could have. If someone dumped 8 tons of sawdust on your farm tomorrow, what would you do with it? A few of you probably already have an idea. Drop it below. Ray Doblin was the one who noticed first. He'd driven past that stubborn stretch of pasture for years and watched it struggle every August like clockwork. That spring, he pulled his truck over, got out, and stood at the fence studying the grass for a good minute before walking up to Dale's porch. "What do you put over there?" Ray asked. Dale explained it, the compost, the ratios he'd finally gotten right, the whole slow business of turning a failed, sour-smelling pile into something that worked. Ray wasn't convinced. Sawdust compost to him sounded like it shouldn't hold up the way Dale was describing. He said as much. But before he left, he asked whether Dale had any extra he could spare. That question was the moment it shifted. Dale gave him a few bags, mostly to prove a point, not thinking much would come of it. But it was the first time someone else had looked at what he'd built and seen something worth having. First call. A few weeks later, Ray called again, asking for more compost, enough for a garden bed his wife wanted to redo. Not long after, a cattle farmer 2 roads over who'd heard about it secondhand through the feed store called asking about dry bedding grade sawdust. His calving pens had been a mud problem every spring for years. Then a man Dale barely knew called wanting raw sawdust, untouched, straight off the pile, because he ran his own compost operation and wanted to try Dale's ratios himself. Fourth contact. A neighbor offered to trade a load of hay for a truckload of material instead of paying cash, which told Dale something the calls alone hadn't. People weren't just curious anymore. They were treating this like a real resource. Word had moved the way it usually does in farm country. Slow, then steadier. A feed store conversation. Someone seeing the pasture for themselves. A farmer asking where a neighbor's bedding had come from. Dale hadn't advertised a thing. His own farm had become the demonstration. The demand created a new problem, and Dale wasn't naive enough to think it would sort itself out. He still had a substantial amount of raw sawdust sitting along that fence, and moving it, loading it, hauling it, figuring out what was fair to charge for something that had cost him almost nothing to acquire. Took real time and real diesel. He had to decide what he was actually offering. Raw sawdust for people willing to do their own work with it, dry bedding grade material for the livestock operations, and finished compost for anyone who wanted the labor already done. He got the pricing wrong the first time around, badly enough that it took him a few weeks to notice. He'd priced the finished compost only a little above the raw material, forgetting to account for the months of turning, monitoring, and hauling that went into making it. He was losing money on his own labor without realizing it, and it took Carol pointing out how many hours he'd spent behind that tractor for him to sit down and actually work the numbers. That was when it clicked for him. He wasn't charging for sawdust. He was charging for the work it took to make sawdust useful. Once he understood that, the pricing made sense, and so did everything else. If you enjoy seeing how ordinary farm problems turn into unexpected opportunities, consider subscribing, because Dale's biggest surprise was still ahead of him. By the following year, Dale wasn't just fielding the occasional curious call. He had something close to a dependable rhythm. Kurt kept sending loads his way, glad to have. Somewhere reliable to put the material instead of fighting the state over burn permits. Dale kept a rotation going. Fresh sawdust coming in. Some going straight out as bedding. Some going into compost piles that took months to mature. Some staying raw for the handful of farmers who wanted to run their own experiments. Not everyone came around. A couple of the men who'd laughed at him that first week still shook their heads when the subject came up, figuring he'd gotten lucky more than anything. Dale let them think what they wanted. He knew what the work had actually taken. Over that year, between compost sales, bedding, and raw material, he figured he'd cleared somewhere around $4,000 above his costs. Modest by most standards, but real money from something that had been sitting worthless, even burdensome, on his fence line the year before. More than the cash itself, he'd cut his own spending on fertilizer and bedding straw enough that the whole arrangement had paid for itself twice over before he ever sold a bag. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the kind of steady, unglamorous income that keeps a small farm running through a hard stretch. Dale still remembers standing by that fence the day the first truck backed in, looking at the size of what he'd agreed to, and wondering if he'd made a bad call. A year and a half later, he stood in roughly the same spot. The pile that had once swallowed a whole corner of pasture was down to a low, dark mound, worked through by use and time, and steady demand he hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted. His phone rang while he was out there. Another farmer, one he barely knew from 2 counties over, asking if he had any material left. Dale told him he'd have to check what he could spare. He looked out at the pasture that had once given him nothing but trouble, holding its color deep into a dry June now, and thought about how strange the whole thing had turned out. The mill couldn't get rid of the stuff fast enough. A year later, farmers were calling to ask for it. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't magic. It was ratios he'd gotten wrong before he got them right. A compost pile that failed before it worked. Months of turning material behind a tractor in the cold. The sawdust had never been worth anything on its own. What was worth something was what he'd learned to do with it. If you've got something sitting around your own place that everybody else considers useless, you might be closer than you think to figuring out what to do with it. Subscribe if you'd like more stories like this one, and tell us in the comments. What overlooked material on your farm do you think you could put to work?